When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 22nd, 2022, the world watched in shock. As global geopolitics were thrown into chaos, nations scrambled to respond, hoping to swiftly end the conflict. But Putin's grand plan quickly unraveled. He boasted that Ukraine would fall within 2 weeks. Yet here we are, with Russia bleeding soldiers, equipment, and resources at a staggering rate. What was supposed to be a quick victory has turned into a slow, grinding disaster. While Putin miscalculated at every turn, Ukraine, backed by superior Western technology and training, has turned the tide, transforming a supposed blitzkrieg into a relentless trench warfare standoff. Now, as the war drags on with no end in sight, one critical question looms large. How much longer can Russia hold on? According to some, Russia's military has already passed a precarious balancing point and is on the brink of collapse, alongside the entire Russian economy. This is somewhat contradictory to the official numbers that suggest that Russia has managed to amass over 3 million active military personnel, making it the 5th largest military in the world by manpower. Compare this to the numbers peddled by the Russian government immediately before the invasion started in early 2022. In January 2022, it was suggested that Russia had roughly 360,000 active military personnel on the Ukrainian front, a figure that is roughly 25% of the current number. This would mean that despite being in active war for roughly 30 months now, Russia managed to skyrocket its available manpower and put significant pressure on both Ukraine and countries that are sending military aid to it. Of course, this massive conscription effort is practically unsustainable in the long run, and it's precisely why some experts suggest that Russia could put itself between a rock and a hard place by pushing for a widespread conscription. Additionally, we've yet to talk about the casualties incurred by both Russia and Ukraine over the past 30 months of push-and-pull warfare. And for that, the image can get increasingly complicated. In the first few months of the war, both Russia and Ukraine heavily overplayed their successes and underpinned the opposing military. This led to a somewhat odd situation, where early reports couldn't be verified for accuracy due to rampant differences between Russian, Ukrainian, and independent outlets, i.e., those originating from the UK or the US. One such example was the first report made a few months after the start of the invasion. In June 2022, Russian casualties varied between 500 to somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000, or were reported to climb up to 30,000 at the time, depending on whether you decided to believe the Russian, NATO, or Ukrainian reports. Over time, however, several reporting bodies have realized that it was possible to extract the true number of casualties on the Russian side. It was suggested that early Ukrainian reports were indeed overestimating Russian casualties by roughly double. On the other hand, early Russian reports underplayed their army's casualties at a rate of 0.3 to 1. Later Ukrainian reports seem to have removed this bias, and even Russian estimates started to inch closer to the actual numbers reported by independent authorities. So where does that leave us today? According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Russia has lost around 585,000 soldiers as of August 9, 2024. This number seems in line with the combined reports from the British Ministry of Defense in May 2024 and the Ukrainian reports over the past few months of the highly disorganized summer offensive of Kharkiv. The first suggested that Russia has lost roughly 500,000 soldiers through May 2024. While the second provided a rough estimate of 70,000 additional losses over the 2 subsequent months. Perhaps even more interestingly, despite Russia not making significant progress in moving deeper into Ukrainian soil, the casualties have started to mount more rapidly than ever. In the first few months of 2024, it was estimated that Russia was losing 800 to 1,000 soldiers per day. This figure has risen to mid-1100s during the summer offensive. Today, the Ukrainian Pravda suggests that Russia is losing over 1,200 soldiers per day. This is a staggering number of casualties incurred during a war that doesn't seem like it's going to end soon. Or is it? It's important to compare the number of casualties with the starting Russian personnel reserves. Considering that Russia started with 360,000 soldiers and lost nearly 590,000 over the past 30 months. It would suggest that Russia pulled hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the reserve and managed to conscript another million or so into active service. Where are all these men coming from, and how is Russia sustaining this growth so far? The dark truth is that Russia has been making significant conscription efforts for the past few years, offering increasing bonuses for volunteers who want to join the military. According to The Economist, a military volunteer can earn between 2 and 3 times the national average salary. Considering that Russia's less urbanized areas have significantly lower average incomes, particularly those with a higher prevalence of ethnic minorities, the government's conscription efforts have found more success in these areas. Of course, this has led to unprecedented discrepancies in the ethnic makeup of the Russian military, which have been propagated in the casualty reports. According to a PBS report in 2023, men from Barakia, a Russian republic whose residents are descended from Mongols, were 75 times more likely to die than men from Moscow. This level of inequality between the elite, so to speak, and the more distant areas of Russia has spurred more than one protest in local governments. Despite that, the Russian military efforts have continued seemingly unabated. One of the significant contributors to that is the lopsided budget allocation towards national defense and military spending. Over the past 2 years, Russia's defense spending has nearly doubled from $72 billion to roughly $140 billion. This comes from the 2024 military budget being roughly a third of the government's budget, a rate practically unrivaled in the modern world. As a result, it's estimated that Russia is spending around 6% of its GDP on national defense and military, compared to 3.5% in the US or the average of 2.7% across NATO. Of course, that's just the top of the economic incentives that Russia has created to bolster its military. Over the past 2 years, the country has increased the number of employees in the military industry sector from 2.5 million to 3 million. This goes hand in hand with the overall increases in salary levels in this sector, aimed at improving the state of the Russian military and reducing setbacks from ineffective offensive campaigns. Additionally, the government's attempts to train more soldiers have yielded surprising efforts, perhaps due to the aggressive campaigning and generous military contract terms, at least payment-wise. In December 2023, Putin stated that the military had recruited 486,000 personnel in 2023. This would imply that 1,500 people a day had signed contracts with the military. These figures could be exaggerated, much like many other similar ones regarding Russian successes often are, and don't accurately reflect the variety and often ad hoc nature of Russian military recruitment. Reports also imply that the military sector has been cutting corners in terms of providing recruits with both training and equipment, undermining the Russian military's ability to conduct complex offensive operations. Regardless, Russia has seemingly managed to somewhat skirt the economic and demographic problems that would normally plague a country in a large-scale military conflict. This would normally paint a stark picture of the future of Ukraine. But there's always a bit more to the story, especially when we start digging a bit deeper into the economic issues that Russia is almost certainly going to experience in the coming years. The main economic malaise that Russia has been experiencing for the past 2.5 years is the increased number of economic sanctions imposed by the US, which a vast majority of other countries abide by. For example, the EU, which was once one of the largest importers of oil and natural gas from Russia, and a significant trading partner, has reduced imports from Russia by roughly 80%, cutting off significant cash flows into Russian coffers. To counteract that, China has spearheaded a positive trading relationship with Russia, with 2023 trade raising by 26% from the year before. Despite the total trade going down in 2024, it's still well above pre-2022 levels. The trends indicate that China is positioning itself as a significant economic influence for Russia, because without this trade, Putin would be hard-pressed to find large foreign trading partners. China has also pivoted to being one of the main importers of Russian gas and oil, heavily contributing to the country's booming energy sector. This all goes to say that China is currently one of the main reasons why Russia has been unable to economically support its military and maintain its significant soldier count. This doesn't come without significant potential consequences. However, as the number of people working in the industry sectors, particularly military equipment manufacturing and energy, increases, Russia will have a harder time finding new volunteers for military service. This is especially due to the booming sectors requiring another sector, services, to employ more and more people to funnel funds back into the Russian government via taxes. As a result, there are fewer people who can work in other industries, particularly manufacturing and agriculture. which are the backbones of a country that's in an active war. It bears mentioning that throughout this video, we've consistently referred to Russian losses as casualties. This term encompasses both soldiers who are no longer fit for active service and deaths. The actual number of deaths is much harder to ascertain since official media outlets have not metric with significant precision. There were only a few independent outlets that have taken on this responsibility, including Mediazona from Russia and Medusa from Latvia. According to the latest available report from Mediazona, which was made in early 2024, roughly 24 months after the invasion, the overall death toll of Russia's military is around 50,000. Additionally, the report suggests that the number of deaths has increased by 25% between 2023 and 22. This would imply that subsequent pushes by Russia are far likelier to increase the death toll. This shouldn't come as a particular surprise when we go back to the fact that the Russian military has pretty much spent its initial military. As a result, the government's efforts to bolster the military have replaced soldiers with more training and experience in official drills with volunteers pulled from the general population, reservists, and even prisoners. This is supported by the fact that official news outlets in 2023 have started finding fewer and fewer casualties from the Russian military and Wagner mercenary groups, especially for soldiers in the age ranges that more closely correlate to being in active military service. Let's take the 50,000 deaths figure from the earlier report at face value and account for another 6 months of active warfare as the average value of last year's figures. This would imply that the Russian death toll in August 2024 is between 60,000 and 63,000 soldiers. However, BBC Russia's report in June 2024 has suggested that the actual total number of dead could be as much as twice as high, totaling around 130,000 people. When compared to the number of casualties, which was previously estimated to be roughly 585,000, this leaves between 450,000 and 520,000 people who are alive, but no longer fit for active service. What happened to these 500,000 people? There are a few scenarios. First, some of the soldiers were captured by Ukrainian forces, and either being kept as prisoners of war until it ends or being actively traded with Russia for Ukrainian soldiers. These don't account for many casualties, however, so their numbers don't have an immediate impact on Russia's economy or tactics. However, what they can affect is general Russian morale. A few Western news outlets have interviewed captured Russian soldiers. Their accounts suggest the current state of the Russian military is a generally grim affair, with the Russian government desperate to push more people to the Ukrainian front. Not all of the Western outlets are available in Russia, as the government tries to maintain a stranglehold on official state media and create a more positive, for them, idea of how the war is going. But those stories that do slip out have the potential of dissuading potential recruits from volunteering to the front solely because of the larger paychecks that the government is promising. The larger group of casualties are people who are too injured to return to the front. Depending on the scale of the injuries, these soldiers might need to recuperate for years at a time. Additionally, they might no longer be capable of working at all. This might not sound like much, but it can have serious negative consequences for the Russian economy. Since the wounded soldiers are no longer capable of working, it means that a portion of the population that should be in working condition isn't. Furthermore, these soldiers are likely receiving financial aid from the government as part of their military contracts and also need to be taken care of by their families. The first point is significant since the aid is effectively going down the drain, so to speak. When we consider that a third of the government's budget is already being drained into national defense and military, what all this means is that the Russian casualties are not only past spending that has gone nowhere, but are actively hampering the rest of the country's economy by putting an active strain on it to support the wounded soldiers. So far, we've been discussing Russian soldiers and how they affect the country's economy. But there's an additional factor in play that might be even more concerning. Demographics. The age range for the Russian military is not particularly narrow, at between 18 and 30 years of age, but it's still only a part of the total male population. According to the UN World Population Prospect Report from 2019, there were roughly 2 million Russian males, aged from 20 to 34. For simplicity's sake, let's consider that these age ranges roughly correlate to the active military range, and that the trends can be considered the same. The same report suggested that Russia has reduced its fertility rate to an anemic 1.2 children per woman between 1999 and 2001. The children born during that time are in the peak of the demographic that represents the suitable military age range. Further, the report implied that Russia would have some 12 million applicable males by 2025, a figure roughly 20% lower than the one in 2019. One of the main figures presented in the report also stated that Russia's current militarization rate is 31% of all available males in the age range. The report suggested that Russia would rapidly need to pull from the dwindling supply of young men just to maintain its military. The militarization rate for 2025 was projected to be closer to 8% in 2025 and 8% in 2030. These figures would be some of the highest militarization rates in the world. They would mean that Russia would already be pulling a significant part of its government budget into national defense and military, and the country would need a steady supply of immigrants to account for the nationals who serve in the military. And then COVID-19 happened. By 2021, the report figures show that the country lost 800,000 people to the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic more heavily increased mortality rates in the demographic that isn't really applicable to the metrics we're dealing with in the video, but the country still lost a significant number of people, and the working population cycled itself to the younger generation. This meant that the jobs of people who died during the pandemic are now being performed by people who are potentially within the military age. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. The militarization figures presented in the 2019 UN report were already starting to get obsolete due to the pandemic's impact, but it's safe to say that a new report would suggest a much grimmer state of affairs in Russian demographics. The most recent reports of Russia having 3 million active personnel, combined with the 2019 predictions of the population distribution, would imply that the militarization rate for ages 18 to 30 is a staggering 6%. Of course, the actual figure is highly unlikely to be as high, considering that the active personnel numbers are pulling from more than the soldiers. However, it's still likely that the figure is rapidly approaching double digits. The one thing that this figure still does not account for is the Russians who have also left the country in the wake of the invasion. Some figures suggest that as many as 900,000 people have left Russia after the invasion started, and that a significant majority of them don't have short-term plans of going back to the country. According to Alfa Bank, one of Russia's largest private banks, the country has lost around 5% of its available workforce from emigration alone, creating a significant dent in the country's economy. Perhaps more important, however, is the fact that a decent number of people who have left the country also fall within military age. This created yet another outflow of potential Russian soldiers and staggered the country's efforts to reform the military in the wake of heavy losses in Ukraine. The emigration trend also suggests that people leaving Russia are highly skilled or paid, which disproportionately hurts the country's economy, as the 5% of the population loss is likely to contribute to far more than a 5% loss in potential taxes. When we take all these figures into account, Russia has rapidly gone through its available manpower from the ideal military range, especially for areas that are more prone to volunteer for military service. The less urban and poorer regions farther from the Kremlin. As a result, the government might start to diversify its efforts toward the population that has so far been relatively underrepresented in the military. The larger population centers such as Moscow or St. Petersburg. If that happens, it would create a positive feedback loop of economic losses. The government would be actively recruiting from the capable male population, creating gaps in the industries that heavily depend on the same population to function normally. The gaps would then need to be filled with more people, which would then only exacerbate the problems that the other industries are facing. Furthermore, the government creating widespread conscription efforts at the political, ideological, and cultural heart of the country could have devastating effects on the population as a whole. We don't need to remind you that the country has gone through several widespread protests in recent years, garnering both local and international attention. The fact that Moscow itself would start losing economically from the war might just be the final nail in the coffin for the Russian campaign in Ukraine. It could persuade a larger and more influential part of the Russian population, economically and politically, to force the government's hand to cut its losses in the military and reduce the rampant militarization growth. But since this is still a bit uncertain, let's say that Russia somehow manages not to collapse on itself economically and politically, and that the Russian military continues to replace the casualties with fresh recruits. How do the main Russian rivals stand in the war? Let's start with the other side of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Economically, Ukraine has been pumping out 36% of its GDP into national defense, specifically the military. The US is spending 5%. Demographically, however, Ukraine isn't faring significantly better. The UA Losses website maintains a record of confirmed deaths in Ukraine, something that's pretty much unheard of on the Russian side, which gives us a slightly more accurate picture. The website currently lists around 57,000 Ukrainian deaths in the invasion of Ukraine. This is an interesting figure, considering the previously discussed numbers on the Russian side. If we take the lower estimates of Russian deaths, 60,000, it would mean that both countries have a similar death toll, despite Ukraine having roughly half the total population, and thus the potential military size. Of course, it's also likely that the more pessimistic estimate of 130,000 Russian deaths is indeed the correct one. This would imply that Ukraine and Russia are losing manpower at a similar rate. One thing to note is that the website doesn't differentiate between military and civilian losses, the latter of which is estimated to be in the range of 5 to 11,000. As the aggressor in the war, Russia has a much lower casualty rate for civilians, but still has one nonetheless. However, it should also be noted that the total Ukrainian casualties are likely much lower than that of Russia. A report from the Russian Ministry of Defense suggests that Ukraine had 440,000 casualties by February 2024. Knowing that Russia routinely bolsters these numbers, it's difficult to take the estimate at face value. The reports from August 2023 suggest that Ukraine had around 190,000 military casualties. If we extrapolate that to today, that's still around 350,000 casualties, and even that could be grossly incorrect. This is especially true considering that Russia didn't make a meaningful campaign from the start of 2024 until the devastatingly ineffective summer campaign. In the campaign, Russia has surpassed 1,000 casualties per day, while the Ukrainian casualties have only been a fraction of that number. The discrepancy is likely due to the US managing to send the newest round of financial and military equipment aid in early 2024, most of which includes long-range artillery, which gives Ukraine a further reach into the Russian mainland. The range allows Ukrainian forces to cut down Russian troops before they can set up the existing fortifications. The result is that Russia is effectively replacing dead recruits with even newer recruits, and the military doesn't have nearly enough time to train them. It's made the Russo-Ukrainian front into a meat grinder for the Russian military, which is likely going to create even more problems for the country's dwindling morale. On Ukraine's side of the front, the government has increasingly lowered the draft age from 27 to 25. This means that the country would effectively increase a potential supply of able men to pull from if it decides to conscript more soldiers. However, that law keeps the mobilization age at 27, meaning that recruits will still likely need to undergo 2 years of training before they get called up to the front. Of course, the current state of the law is unlikely to remain the same, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky suggested that if push comes to shove, the mobilization age will be dropped to 25 as well. The move has been met with criticism, as Ukraine has also suffered significant losses due to emigration and displacement, and lowering the draft age might exacerbate the speed at which men will try to leave the country, which is currently forbidden under martial law. But it's not only Russia and Ukraine whose soldier counts we need to care about. The EU has agreed that Russia is posing an increased threat to the Western world, and has been making significant improvements. The most prominent countries are Germany and Poland. For Germany's part, the country has finally agreed to spend over 2% of its GDP on national defense. The country's government plans to bolster the Bundeswehr, the country's military, to roughly 180,000 people, giving it a 70-year peak. Of course, Germany is also one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world. On Poland's side, the country is already spending roughly 4% of its GDP on national defense. The government's plan is to turn this budget into one of the most populous armies in the world, with the current active military size at roughly 180,000. The government plans to recruit roughly 150,000 people in the coming decade, counting for retirements. The plan is to maintain an army of 300,000 within Poland alone. This figure would make it comparable to what Russia threw at Ukraine in the starting months of the war. Of course, since Poland is a NATO member. It would also be bolstered by its neighbors. While the military size of most prominent NATO countries might not seem like a big deal now, they are important in the long term. Regardless of the Russo-Ukrainian war, Russia has lost a significant number of soldiers and is currently grinding through relatively untrained troops in an attempt to shore up its defenses. This means that as the war ends, Russia's military would likely be at its weakest in years, leaving it practically defenseless. NATO is unlikely to use this to its advantage, but some other countries might. Enter China, one of Russia's largest trading partners and allies in the current conflict. Despite their friendly disposition, the relationship between Russia and China is heavily favored towards the latter. Over the past few years, China has carved out a significant influence on Russian soil. Many Chinese products have become market leaders in Russia, such as smartphones or cars and even agricultural equipment. This has undermined Russia's native manufacturing capacity, effectively making it depend even more on Chinese imports. Additionally, China is currently one of the biggest importers of Russian gas and oil. However, China has been making sweeping claims and plans to improve its land-based trade network, mainly through the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The BRI aims to connect China to the Middle East via Central Asia. This would allow China to bypass both Russia in the north and the U.S. chokehold on the Strait of Malacca in the south, the country's most vital maritime trade route point. If China manages to create a stable connection to the Middle East, it could easily obtain its gas and oil without relying on maritime trade. It would make it much less dependent and afraid of U.S. countermeasures. Why is this important? Russia's Siberia and Far East territories are relatively underutilized by the country due to their distance from Moscow. Siberia contains vast deposits of minerals, woods, and even fresh drinking water, since Lake Baikal is the most voluminous freshwater lake in the world, and China and Russia already have territorial disputes surrounding the region of Outer Manchuria, which was Chinese territory before the Opium Wars in the 19th century. If China reduces its dependence on Russian gas imports and fulfills the BRI, it could possibly invade Russia to get hold of the precious resources that the Russian territories have. And in its currently weakened state, Russia would practically be a pushover. Of course, this is all purely speculative, but recent Chinese moves make hostile actions against another country, whether that's Russia or someone else, not so much of a question of if, but when. With that in mind, Russia's military might presently be growing, but it's growing in such a state that it's possibly already surpassed the point of sustainability. If Putin doesn't end the war in Ukraine, someone might come and end it for him. But what do you think? Does Russia's current military progress mean it could win in Ukraine in the relatively near future? Leave your comments down below and thank you for watching.